Amat merat ike tesolderat igmerut.
Hey y'all, Dave here. Welcome to my main channel where I mostly discuss philosophy and atheism. In this series of videos I'm going to be discussing both of those topics along with some skepticism. Or more specifically, I'm going to be discussing skepticism of miracles along with Hume's work on miracles. An argument that I consider to be a reasonably powerful one when it comes to the rejection of miracle claims. Recently, Capturing Christianity released one of his 3 questions for atheists videos, with this one having a focus on evidence of miracles. I threw out a quick response to that video and had some very interesting replies to it in the comment section, so thank you to all who responded. Some of what I'm going to cover here will kind of respond to some of that, but I'm mainly going to focus on responding to Cameron's arguments. That was kind of my intention from the beginning, to throw out a quick response to Capturing Christianity and then make a longer Hume-focused video. I'll be responding to Cameron's video again here, so if you haven't watched the other one, don't worry, you'll see Cameron's questions here too. But instead of the quick responses I gave in the other video, I'll give a discussion on Hume's work as a response, along with some other things. We'll begin first with the topic related to Cameron's first question about proportioning our beliefs to the evidence, a question which prompts a couple of other further questions. What is evidence, and what does it mean to proportion our beliefs to the evidence? Let's begin first with the question of what evidence is. So, I already have a video where I discussed the idea of what evidence is, called A Brief Talk About Evidence. In that video, I discuss evidence, what it is, how it's used, and that kind of thing. It's not a particularly technical discussion, but my aim with it was to get people to understand how evidence is used. I'll leave a link to it in the description if you want to watch it, but I'll give a brief talk about it here too, so you don't need to go watch it if you don't want to. Of course, the best place to start with anything like this is a dictionary definition. In the hopes of keeping the video length down, I won't do my usual 3 different dictionaries. I'll just choose one colloquial definition, then move on to a slightly more technical one. Both of these images come from the online Cambridge Dictionary. One is the UK definition and one is the US definition. But they both essentially say the same thing. Evidence is anything that helps to prove or give reason to believe that something is true. So if I say that there is a bus at 3:30 p.m. from the local bus stop, and I show a timetable with 3:30 p.m. on it at that stop, then I have provided evidence for that being true. I know, I should and could provide various examples here, but you get the point being made, and I'll keep expanding on the idea of evidence as we go along. For now, let's move on to a slightly different kind of dictionary. The Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy defines evidence as that which raises or lowers the probability of a proposition, while the Penguin Reference Dictionary of Philosophy defines evidence as that which provides grounds for a belief or a theory. Both of these are somewhat similar to the Cambridge Dictionary definition provided a moment ago. All 3 define evidence as something that points towards the truth of some proposition, claim, or belief, or something that gives reason to believe the truth of something. As I want to keep the video as short as possible, I'm going to present one more. This one is once again slightly more technical than the previous ones. This one comes to us from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry Evidence. In this entry, evidence is defined as such. You can see the image on screen here, along with this. As you can see, this one is definitely more technical than the previous ones. Let me simplify it a little though, because it's not quite as complicated as it looks. In the case of the first SCP one, it basically breaks down to something is evidence for some hypothesis if and only if the probability of the hypothesis and the evidence being true when taken together is greater than the probability of the hypothesis being true when taken alone. In other words, it's technical jargon for what the other definitions say. Evidence is that which raises the probability that some claim or proposition is true. The other definition says much the same thing, except talks about evidence against a hypothesis. Something is evidence against some hypothesis if and only if the probability of the hypothesis and the evidence taken together being true is lower than the probability of the hypothesis taken alone. In other words, something is evidence against a proposition or claim if it lowers the probability of that claim or proposition being true. So here we can put together a reasonable working definition of evidence. Evidence is some piece of data that raises or lowers the probability of some claim or proposition. If it lowers the probability, then it's evidence against the claim or proposition, while raising the probability means that it's evidence for the claim or proposition. Of course, it's still more complicated than this, as anyone who has studied the subject will know. So let's have a brief chat about that, as that will help lead us into the discussion about David Hume's argument. As can probably be guessed from the Stanford Encyclopedia entry, evidence is not something that exists in isolation. A piece of data alone is not evidence for anything in particular. Consider it like this. Imagine that I hold a rock in my hand and present it to you. I say nothing about the rock, I just show it to you. Would you say that rock is evidence? I would imagine your answer here would be something like no, or something like evidence of what? If your answer is that it is evidence, then I'd be curious as to why you think that rock alone and me holding it up is evidence and what it's evidence of. Now, imagine that I tell you that someone fell over and banged their head on the rock. Once I add that detail to me showing you the rock, this changes things somewhat. We now have a claim or hypothesis about the rock. Thinking back to the definitions of evidence given before, this rock still wouldn't be evidence for that claim. The rock alone doesn't really raise the probability that the claim is true. It's just a rock. Now, what if there was blood on the rock? Would that change things? I would argue here that it would raise the probability that the claim is true. If somebody had fallen over and banged their head on the rock, then blood is certainly something we would expect to see on it. So the blood, as well as the information that people bleed when they fall over and bang their head on rocks, would raise the probability that the claim is true. You might respond here that it doesn't raise the probability, or it doesn't count as evidence because people also leave blood on rocks when they fall and bang their knee or hand on it. And I would partially agree with you. Instead, I would say that it only raises it a minimal amount because the information just provided counts against the claim and lowers the probability. We could go on here and add in that I saw this happen myself and I collected the rock afterwards. Of course, it would also be evidence of me being a bit strange, because normal people don't generally pick up rocks that people bang their head on and bled all over, but we'll ignore that for now. Would me telling you that I saw it and collected the rock change your mind that it's evidence for my claim? It might or might not. That would depend on several factors, like how well you knew me, how much you trust me, and that kind of thing. If you knew who I was and knew I could be trusted, that would affect it being evidence for the claim. If you knew who I was and knew that I told tall tales, then it would count against it being evidence for the claim. If you didn't know me at all, then it would be neither evidence for nor evidence against the claim. You're probably getting the picture that is being painted here. Evidence is not something that stands alone, outside of a context. Evidence is something that exists within what is essentially a story being told about some claim, hypothesis, or proposition. It is the bits we use to tell ourselves and others whether it is true. Not only does it exist within a context, but it exists within various frameworks like the law, science, history, and even personally and subjectively. What counts as evidence in history might not count as evidence in law, and what counts as evidence in both of those things might not count as evidence in science. Each framework has its own criteria for what counts as evidence. Another framework that evidence exists in is our subjective framework, as seen with the example of me telling you that I saw someone fall and hit their head on the rock. You counting it as evidence would depend on your relationship with me. If you knew me and knew I was trustworthy, then me telling you that would raise the probability of it being true and would count as evidence. In other circumstances, it might be neutral, or even evidence against it being true. In the subjective framework, what might count as evidence for me might not count as evidence for you. There is an interpretive element to evidence as well. How I see some piece of data or information might be different to how you see it, and vice versa. That depends on things like our experiences, our prior beliefs, and our epistemic frameworks. Evidence is a complicated thing, and there is nothing beyond contextual frameworks that demand the qualities that evidence must have, or how evidence must be interpreted. When it comes to the subjective end, it really is kind of a lawless land. So yeah, evidence is a very complicated thing. Evidence might be easy to define, but not so easy beyond that. So this was meant to be a short, brief section on that, but as you can see, or hear, even describing that element of evidence gets complicated. But understanding this is important to what's coming next. Let's go back to Capturing Christianity's first question here. So now that we have a basic understanding of what evidence is, how it works, and its complicated nature, let's move on to discussing proportioning our beliefs to the evidence. Before that, we'll just remind ourselves of the first question that Capturing Christianity asked.
All right, I've got 3 more questions for atheists. Here is number 1. Do you believe that our beliefs ought to be proportioned to the evidence? So should we only really believe something if we've got evidence in favor of it?
As can be seen, Cameron asked whether we think belief should be proportioned to the evidence. He interprets this as only believing something if we have evidence in favor of it. But proportioning our beliefs to the evidence is a little more complicated than simply having evidence in favor of a belief. Like we just saw, even the idea of what evidence is and what counts as evidence can be a complicated thing. Let's have a quick look at what David Hume has to say about the topic in his work in Enquiry concerning human understanding from 1748. The part we're going to discuss comes from his section where he discusses skepticism about miracles, which is where I got the argument from for my response in the previous shorter video. Before beginning, it's important to understand that Hume was an empiricist and believed that all knowledge begins with our senses and experiences. As he states in his work, experience guides our reasoning. Our experiences count as evidence for us. Take the experience of gravity, for example. When we drop something, it always follows that whatever we drop will fall to the ground. This experience holds all of the time, in any place or any time. At least on Earth, anyway. The experience and expectation of it happening 100% of the time is also something that we use as proof, and a very strong proof at that. Of course, this doesn't count as proof in the sense of something like logic or mathematics. It is not an equation, but an experience. It is proof in the sense that if someone was to tell you that they could jump 20 feet into the air from a standing position and you said, prove it, the proof expected here wouldn't be a logical argument or a mathematical equation. The proof would be a demonstration. It would be based in experience. It would take experiencing it happening to overcome our consistent and regular experiences of people not being able to jump 20 feet into the air from a standing position. The proof that they can't comes from our never having experienced it, and in fact experiencing the opposite regularly. Just as our experiences of gravity are proof that things will never fall upwards anywhere on Earth, regardless of place or time. Our experiences tell us that 100% of the time when we drop something it will fall down, and our beliefs are proportioned to that. We believe that the next time we drop something it will fall down, and we believe this will happen without any kind of irregularity. This is the same with people jumping 20 feet into the air from a standing position. The fact that we have never seen it, and have only ever seen it not happen, means that our beliefs are proportioned to this experience and fact. If someone tells us they can, our belief will be that they cannot. At least not until we see it happen, and probably see it happen before our eyes. Even if we see it happen before our eyes, we will probably be very skeptical of what happened. Our experiences of the 100% regular nature of the opposite happening means that our first thoughts would be that some trickery has happened, and that we have been deceived somehow. We might imagine some kind of special effects being used in the case of the jump, or some illusion in the case of something falling upwards after being dropped. After all, we have experiences of these kind of illusions, tricks, and deceptions. Therefore, our belief is proportioned towards it being a trick, rather than it being a genuine feat or genuine breaking of the laws of nature that we have come to expect to experience 100% of the time. However, after exhausting all courses of investigation and coming to accept that what happened was not a deception, illusion, or trick, then we will most likely change the way our belief is proportioned, or at least we ought to anyway. We would no longer think it was impossible. Our experiences would tell us that it was incredibly unlikely, or some kind of fluke event or ability. We would not expect it to happen again except in situations that were alike. We would expect that person to be able to jump 20 feet from a standing position again, but we would not expect the next person that claimed it to be able to. Though we may be slightly more open to it happening because the 100% regularity has been broken. Same with an example of gravity being disrupted. After all, now that we have experience of gravity in different situations, we do not expect things to fall down 100% of the time. Consider the experience of something like the cosmonauts in the ISS. When they let go of something, we do not expect it to fall down, we expect it to float. Because that is what we consistently and regularly experience when we see them doing it. Well, at least those of us who are sane anyway. However, we do not expect the same to happen here on Earth, because we understand that they are not like-for-like scenarios. Our experiences proportion our beliefs to those settings and what to expect from each setting. This is something like what David Hume meant when he speaks of our beliefs being proportioned to the evidence. Our experiences in the world count as evidence for what the world is like, and the regularity of those experiences count for the strength of our belief in some claim, proposition, or hypothesis. When we experience something 100 times out of 100, our belief is at its strongest, and we consider that a kind of full proof that something is the way it is and cannot be otherwise. However, when we experience something 90 times out of 100, the strength of our belief is less strong, with that strength diminishing the more times we see something not happen when we expect it to happen. When it averages out to happening as many times as it not happening, then our belief is one where we are more hesitant. We are more reluctant to believe one way or another. Or in a slightly more technical sense, we become agnostic about it. It's to something like this that Hume was referring when he speaks of a wise man proportioning his beliefs to the evidence. Our experiences count as evidence towards some claim, proposition, or hypothesis. The more regularly we experience something, the higher our confidence in that belief should be. When we experience something 100 times out of 100, then our confidence should be at its highest. With the more experiences that counter the regular experiences, the lower our confidence should be in that belief. Of course, there is a little more to it than that also. How we interpret our experiences, what we consider to be evidence for something, our epistemic standards and frameworks, our desires, and more will all play a part in how our beliefs are proportioned, and the strength of them. But that will be a discussion for later. For now, let's end this video here, and in the next one move on to Cameron's second question, as well as Hume's account of testimony and some more of his skeptical argument against miracles. So that's the end of this part. I was going to do the whole thing as one video, but realized just how long the script was getting and figured it would be better off in a few parts. Once it's all finished, I'll join them together for one long video for anyone who wants to watch it that way. In the next part, I'll be discussing the second question that Cameron asked about whether verified miracles would count as evidence for God, exploring what a miracle is, looking at some miracles, as well as looking at whether or not verification is even possible. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video or found it interesting, don't forget to give it a like, and share if you think someone else might. If you're not already subbed to my channel, then please consider doing so. You'd be helping me out a lot. I also have a Patreon if you want to show some support to my channel and help out a struggling philosophy enthusiast and communicator. There's also a PayPal link in the description if you want to throw a couple of bucks my way to buy me a coffee or something like that. Expect the next part of this soon. Until the next time, I hope life is treating you amazingly. Take care. Bye.